Our second speaker is Darren Wallace, presenting What's New with Adobe 2021 in Education. Welcome, Darren.
Thanks, Rusty. Just do the old screen sharing. Well, today I'll be covering what's new with Adobe 2021 in education. My name's Darren Wallace, and I'm a lead systems engineer with DataJar. Well, then maybe I should ask my title to be changed to Adobe Deployment Engineer. I've been working with Macs for over 16 years now, starting out as a hardware tech, right through to consultancy, and now systems engineering. I also help run the London MacAdmins, so if you're ever over in the UK, give us a shout. You can find me in most places, Slack, Twitter, etc. as Daz_Wallace. So at DataJar, we help organizations to manage their Apple devices, whether that be an initial setup, training, hybrid, or full MSP. With a roughly 50-50 split between education and business, with education just edging it. The point of this is that we are dog fooding. The things I'm going to talk about are things we're doing for our customers already. And today I'm talking about Adobe in education, specifically around SDL and the changes for 2021. Although focused on education, some of the information we'll cover would also be relevant to enterprise deployments. I've delivered variations in this talk for the last few years, so there might be some repetitions, but this time I'll be summarizing the console and user setup side of things in order to go into more details around the packaging, deployment and management, as well as the changes over the last year. I'll also sprinkle in various hints as well as things we've discovered as we get to each area. There'll also be a number of articles, blog posts, and supporting items I'll be referencing. For any of these, there'll be a linked blog post shown at the very end that will contain a full list you can access. So don't worry too much about trying to jot these down as we go through. So with this talk, I'm going to look to cover these areas. A recent history of Adobe releases, changes between the previous device license and the newer shared device license. So that's kind of CC 2018 and older to the current 2021. Setting up the user side of things, the package creation and deployment, maintenance of your Adobe deployments, and finally, some support and troubleshooting options. As is tradition now for me, here's my glossary. In these slides in this presentation, I'll be going through a lot of shortened terms, so I thought it would be handy to have this list beforehand to make things a bit easier. So you've got your named user licenses, I'll be referred to as null or NUL, shared device license will be SDL, device license DL, and so on and so on. First things first, a short history lesson. So in the beginning, there was the Creative Suites with a number of different versions. This came with a standard, for the time, serial number license or SNL. Eventually, for packaging this, we had the Adobe Application Manager Enterprise Edition or AAMEE. With the launch of Creative Cloud in June 2013, we switched to using the Creative Cloud Desktop App or CCDA. This allowed the introduction of named user licenses alongside your serial number licenses and gave us a new tool for packaging, the Creative Cloud Packager or CCP. Around May 2014, Adobe added a new subscription model for multi-user devices called a device license. October 2018, Adobe releases Creative Cloud 2019. With this, the serial number license and device license was replaced with a new shared device licensing program. This new license was designed for education use on lab and multi-user devices, allowing them to be able to access some cloud-based services. With this, we also had the launch of a new packaging solution, the Adobe Admin Console, removing the requirement of an OS-specific packaging application at the cost of some features. October 2019, Adobe released Creative Cloud 2020, and note the removal of the CC term from that name. This also brought the minimum supported OS up to macOS High Sierra 1013 from macOS Sierra 1012 we had with 2019. November 2020, a little bit later than previous years, Adobe released the first half of the Creative Cloud 2021 suite, covering most of the non-video sections and apps. This also raised the minimum supported OS up to Mojave 1014. And lastly, in March 2021 this year, Adobe released the remainder of the Creative Cloud 2021 titles, as well as starting to release their Apple Silicon native versions of some titles and installers. So we went through the biggest amount of change from CC 2018 to 2019 and beyond. There are a few core changes to the suite that would affect Apple engineers in education and enterprise, outside the usual updating of the yearly title. First, we've seen changes with the licensing on device that Adobe are using. So out goes the previous serial number license, as well as the new device license used with CC 2018 and older. In comes this new concept of a shared device license that we'll cover at various points today. There is no change for the support of a named user license, where you assign licenses directly to users, or feature restricted licensing, or FRL. We'll not cover much on FRL here, but this is an enterprise-only license model initially intended for air-gapped devices, often in broadcast environments. The next biggest difference is, as part of this move to the the shared device licensing, is that you now have to log in to use these licenses. The device itself is still the thing that's being licensed, but you need to log in with an Adobe ID of some kind in order to use these apps. This Adobe ID must be individual per actual user, and generic Adobe IDs are not allowed as per Adobe's own terms and conditions of use. These Adobe ID logins are cached on a device. So if you're utilizing a single user account per Mac, a single local user account that is, you will need to ensure your end users are logging out of the Adobe account before they log out of that device. With this, we also now actually have 3 different Adobe IDs you can create for your users. You have your standard Adobe ID, your enterprise ID, and a federated ID. The main differences revolve around data ownership, account provisioning, with various pros and cons of each option. I'll get into these in a bit more detail throughout this talk. Not all of the changes are bad. With the new requirement for an Adobe ID login to use these apps, your users can now take advantage of the Adobe Creative Cloud storage and related features, including cloud-based assets, fonts, images, libraries, etc. Additionally, with education, you can assign each user a free Spark license, which will grant 2 GB of storage to each of your users. This is something I'd strongly recommend if you have it available to you. And the last big change, how you create your Adobe packages. Gone is the local applications of old, such as the Creative Cloud Packager and the AAMEE. In its place, we now have a web-based admin portal for all of your packaging needs. We'll also dive into this a little bit later on in the talk. So with these changes, we'll take a deeper dive on some of them, starting off with setting up your users that you need in order to use these new shared device licenses. So the first thing to decide on is what type of Adobe ID suits your needs, a normal Adobe ID, enterprise, or a federated ID. Depending on your needs and the methods of provisioning, you may be forced into a specific type of ID. With Adobe IDs, these will need to be created by the end user. As the end user creates these, they will retain ownership of the ID, as well as any data created and stored within it. Adobe handles the authentication, including password policies and resets. As administrator, you can invite these IDs into your organization, so you can assign licenses, etc., as well as boot them out, but you cannot lock those accounts, you can't delete them, or otherwise take them over from the user. With enterprise Adobe IDs, these will need to be created by the organization and issued to the user. As a result, ownership of the ID and that data stays with the organization, and emergency access can be granted at any time. Adobe will still handle the authentication, but as an administrator, you can grant and revoke access to various services and products, as well as lock and delete that account. And lastly, with federated Adobe IDs, these will need to be created by the organization again and linked to an enterprise directory via federation with SSO or a SAML2 provider. The best way to think of these federated IDs is that it's just an enterprise ID, but with the authentication and possibly the provisioning handled by an external source. Adobe have much more detail on their setup identity article on the various advantages, disadvantages, and use cases. I'll pop a link to the blog post for this. So now you've decided on what type of ID you're going to use. You'll need to set things up within your Adobe Admin Console to accept these users. We'll review the steps from a high level, but Adobe has a great detailed guide to walk you through the process if you haven't done it before. A small side note, if you're planning on using Microsoft Azure SSO or Google Federation integration, there's a different process to follow, which I'll mention later. So firstly, you'll need to create an Adobe directory to store your user information for enterprise or federated IDs. The steps for this are pretty simple, and I've included the screenshot above showing them. Previously, it was explicitly stated it could take up to 48 hours to provision your directory. So it's definitely something that's worth starting sooner rather than later if it's going to be needed. Once you have your directory set up, you'll need to set up your domains for the email addresses or address users will be authenticating from. This will require some DNS records to be created, so ensure to have your correct administrator on hand if required. And again, last point here, if you're using the Azure AD connector or Google Federation Sync, you do not need to manually add your domains. Selected domains from the IDP setup are automatically synced over. So once you have your domains added, you'll need to link them to your directory to complete the setup. You can link multiple domains to the same directory, but they've all got to share the same SSO settings if you do that. And now your last step, provision your users within the Adobe console. This can be done via the Azure or Google connectors, the user sync tool, manually via the admin console, or via the REST API. The Azure and Google Federation configurations are the best way to add users to the admin console. They allow the automatic provisioning of user accounts and licenses, as well as offering a unified authentication experience for your users. The main downside is if you already have these things configured using the now legacy Azure and Google connectors, there isn't a migration path to move you onto the latest implementation with these automatic provisioning features. Adobe are working on this. They were working on this last year as well. The next best option is the user sync tool. This is a command line utility that can take user and group information from an LDAP or AD solution and synchronize that into your admin console. Again, you can then use that group membership and ongoing syncing to control which users get which licenses automatically. Neil Martin, Sound Mac guy, did a great talk on this a few years ago. Again, I'll link to that in the post. The next option is directly in the admin console. This can be in the form of a CSV upload or some artisanally crafted accounts, aka someone goes in and manually clicks the buttons. This isn't something I would really recommend as it's quite manual and very boring, and us being humans, they're going to be prone to make mistakes with it. The last option on here, there's also a user management REST API Adobe provide. This gives access to users, groups, and entitlements or license assignments, much like your user sync tool does. I've not really spent any time with this API, but it does sound like you maybe could create your own user sync tool if the current one doesn't do everything you need. So for all you coders out there, if there's a need, you can build it. One additional bit on data ownership. We touched on this briefly already, but it's worth raising again. So depending on the Adobe license you issue to your users, they'll have access to cloud storage. Now this could be used as an avenue to share institutional data outside of the institute. With a standard Adobe ID, the ownership of that data, regardless of where it's come from, is retained with the user. With the enterprise and federated IDs, the data ownership remains within the organization and access can be requested at any time. Once again, it's back to choosing the right option for your situation and your organization. What about when a user leaves the organization? On the other hand, is it possible for them to take their schoolwork and projects away with them? Well, yes. Adobe have a feature where you can allow your end users to migrate their data from their federated or enterprise ID into a personal Adobe ID. You can find this setting in your admin console. Once enabled, users can trigger a self-service style process to migrate that data over. We've just spoken about the importance of data ownership, so when might this be a good idea? Well, this could be a great thing for students who are leaving your institute and want to carry their work forward with them. Think of this as like a student taking their exercise books and project folders home after finishing their education journey with you. So you've been through all the guides and instructions to set up the back end for your users. What's next? Time to get those software titles packaged and deployed out. For software distribution, you have two core options: self-service via the CCDA or fully managed. So you can run with the self-service model by deploying the CCDA with minimal restrictions, which will allow your users to install whichever Adobe apps and whichever versions they require when they need them. You can even configure the CCDA to allow these installations without any local administration rights. The option has some nice compromises between flexibility for your users whilst providing them with the tools to self-enable. But on the flip side, you lose a lot of control over what titles are deployed and of what versions. As a result, this is not something I'd suggest for labs or devices and other areas where consistency across multiple users and devices is required. The other option you have, and one that has the most advantage for education, is the fully managed option. This involves one of you folks creating Adobe deployment packages via the admin console and deploying these out via your management system of choice. This gives you the ability to control and manage the titles and versions going out to your fleet, but at the cost of more work for yourself. As this tends to be the better option for education, this is the method we'll be concentrating on most during this section. With the package creation process itself, there have been a number of changes. You now use a web console instead of a dedicated app like CCP. You have the option of setting a number of configuration options. New for this year, you can add plugins to some of your packages. And with this, there's also a new concept of packages expiring and or becoming out of date. As mentioned, you'll now need to use the web console to create your packages. This replaces the old Creative Cloud Packager solution and allows you to create packages for other platforms, such as Windows, without being physically on that platform. Unfortunately, this was at the cost of the automation we were able to leverage with CCP. Onto the Packages section, click the Create a Package option to get started. This will kick off the package creation wizard. This wizard will first ask you to choose the license type. If you went for a named user license package, you then have to choose whether it's a self-service or a managed package. Next up, you pick the language and the architecture options. More on the architecture a little bit later on. And then you pick which titles you want to include with this package. A little side note, all of these packages will now always include the CCDA, the Creative Cloud Desktop application. You can actually just not add any other applications to this package and produce a CCDA only package, which can be usable in some cases. Again, this is limited to named user license packages only. You can opt to include plugins relevant to the titles you've added so far. In this example, I included Photoshop, which is why you'll see this selection of plugins. You then get the option to select whichever customizations and configurations you want to be set by this package. Lastly, give your package a name and you kick off the build process. I mentioned talking about some of those configuration options. Just be aware, if you deploy multiple Adobe packages with conflicting settings, typically the last installation wins. But this interaction is undefined, to use an Apple term. Talking of those options, these do include, as I said, allowing users to install and update their own applications, allowing non-admin users to install and update their applications. You can disable auto-update. That won't affect anything like CCDA updating itself, as well as admin tools like RUM and Installer Packages. It's just for the built-in auto-updaters. You can allow users optionally to install their own plugins from CCDA. You can disable the file syncing, and you can customize the installation location for your package. One thing you may have noticed, is that the packages you create will expire after 3 days. At this stage, the download link will instead change to an expired message, as shown here. If you needed to download a new copy of the expired package, you'll need to go through the entire package creation steps from scratch. Something worth knowing. However, on this same screen, you can also see if your previous packages still have the latest version of titles. For titles that are out of date, whether they're expired or not, you can select the package and go through a shortened workflow to create an updated version of the same package. This can optionally include components without any updates, so you can still use this exact same package to install an initial installation onto new devices, as well as to patch your old devices, your existing devices, I should say. So new last year was the change to supplying any Adobe downloads from the admin console in a downloader app. Effectively, you'd create your package, download a disk image with a downloader app, use this to download a zipped installer package, then unzip that package to get access to your install and uninstall packages. Sorry, I should say uninstall that zip to get access to your packages. This change in behavior still catches MacAdmins out today, and obviously me doing this talk. So why have Adobe made this change? Well, Adobe packages themselves, if you've ever delved into them, are very complex with multiple moving parts, more so than most other vendors I've seen. And any downloads on macOS from most or all web browsers would automatically add the old quarantine flag to the downloaded zip file. Recently, we were finding these quarantine flags were being passed onto the Adobe Installer Package components when you ran the unzip, causing lots of weird and wonderful installation failures. With the Downloader app, the flag or attribute is applied to the Downloader app itself, but when that goes and grabs your zipped packages, it will not apply those flags or attributes. This same problematic quarantine bit can also be reapplied if you share these packages around via something like Google Drive or Dropbox. And also had some reports it's happening with airdrop transfers too. So just to be aware of, if you're going to be dragging these things around, you might have to clear out the quarantine attributes manually, in which case you can use this command here. One other thing with these new downloader apps, which first showed up on macOS Big Sur, is that you can only run one of these downloader apps at any one time. On previous macOS versions, you could open up a whole load of them, kick off the downloads, and go take lunch or go home for the day, knowing they'd all be finished by the time you return. macOS X Bytes did a great blog on the issue, which I'll link as well, where Adobe stated this was not actually a supported workflow and has some risk around running multiple copies of the downloader at once. For those that are more adventurous, it is possible to launch the downloaded app multiple times on Big Sur from the command line, but obviously do this at your own risk. I've also heard that Adobe are aware of this limitation and they are working on it, is all I can say. So we mentioned some bits and pieces about architecture. What about support for Apple's newest, latest and fast Macs running non-Intel chipsets? So currently, most Adobe titles will run under Rosetta 2, deployed through whatever current installers you might have laying around. At the time of writing, there are 5 Adobe macOS titles with universal binary support: Lightroom, Photoshop, and then last minute addition on Tuesday, Illustrator, InDesign, and Lightroom Classic. One thing to point out here, though, is although these are universal applications, there is a difference between the application being universal and the package you create also being universal. But what do I mean? Well, first of all, you have 2 different architectures of the titles. For example, currently, Photoshop 2021 will deploy a universal app that works both on Intel and Apple Silicon devices natively. Premiere Pro 2021, however, will only work with Intel natively and with Apple Silicon Macs via Rosetta 2. If you're having to support both Intel and Apple Silicon Macs, you would still expect to only have to use one package because, for example, with Photoshop, it's a universal app, use one package, job done. And with Premiere Pro, okay, it's an Intel-only application, But if you have Rosetta on your Macs, again, you can just use the same package, everyone's happy. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy due to an implementation choice that Adobe have made. When you create your admin console packages, you will see this screen with new options for macOS. When you pick the macOS Intel platform, the resulting package will be configured in such a way that the Adobe deployment tools will only install this on Intel devices. In the same way, if you pick the macOS Apple Silicon platform, the resulting package will only install onto Apple Silicon devices. This is regardless of what platform or architecture the title inside the package supports, and will require you to create and manage 2 packages per Adobe title in order to cover both platforms. So double up of work, double up of packages, double up of storage required, as well as some potential additional work around your management systems to make sure you're deploying the right package to the right devices. Think this isn't great? I've chucked a link to an Adobe feature request in the blog post that I strongly request you all upvote. Adobe's feature request platform is called User Voice. And again, I've highlighted that very clearly in the blog post, which one. If you get lost and you don't know which one it is, please reach out to me on Slack. I'm more than happy to get more people behind this feature request. Right, this is something that caught us out. So the Adobe 2020 titles, when they were released, generally all wanted a minimum macOS of 10.13 or newer. At some point in October or November 2020, Adobe released new patches to the Adobe 2020 suite, which had a higher minimum OS, a minimum OS of 10.14 or newer. If you didn't realize this and you try to install these updated versions of the Adobe 2020 suite to macOS 10.13, they would fail. But only after the Adobe deployment tools attempted part of the install. This could result in an already installed, unpatched version of an Adobe 2020 title actually being removed instead of being patched. For example, you'd start with an unpatched version of After Effects 2020 on macOS 10.13, and would run this package, it would fail, and then you end up with no After Effects 2020 installed at all. So how can you check for these version changes? The honest answer is it's very, very difficult. For some titles, it's in the info.p list near the top of the package contents. For others, it's embedded in the package payload for the installation and is in a terrible format as shown in this example above, the 10 space dot space forward space dot space 3. For other applications, we just weren't able to find a minimum OS version for that. So my suggestion here would be do what you can to look into these things, keep an eye on your fleet of devices, and test these packages when you can. A little sidetrack into the icons. If you utilize Monkey's Software Center, Jamf's self-service, or a similar tool to make these installs available to your users, it makes sense to dress these up with some good-looking icons for each of the titles you're offering. Now, these can be easily grabbed from each installation package without going through a full installation from the path shown above. Again, I've got a blog detailing this, and I'll add a link to this to the blog for this talk. Last little one on package creation, sort of moving into package deployment. If you're a big fan of auto package, and who isn't, we have some auto package recipes that can be used on your locally downloaded installation packages to import these into Monkey and Jamf. We have some custom processors that will pull apart that Adobe package, ensure to collect the right data of exactly what that package is going to install onto a disk for a Mac, then adds that into a Monkey's install array or a Jamf smart group, and then imports these items for you. There are some specific requirements on naming conventions and how you use these, but our data jar auto package repo has a full README under the Adobe 2021 folder. So now you have your package created, let's move on to getting them deployed. We'll take a look at some general installation recommendations, a little bit on blocking apps, a bit on Monkey and a bit on Jamf, over deployment of shared device licenses, as well as a little surprise on Maxon Cinema 4D. So first of all, our first recommendation is not to have a single mega package of all of your titles, and instead create a package per Adobe title. This does have a larger administrative overhead, but will increase the success rate of your deployments. Bear in mind that there's a risk that any of the titles in an installation can fail. If an Adobe installation fails, it will remove all titles that were deployed with that same package. Therefore, by increasing the number of titles you're trying to deploy with the same package, you're increasing the risk that no Adobe titles will make it onto disk. Additional point here, if you have one large package with all of your Adobe titles present, and there's an important patch released to one of those titles, something that you need to be rolling out, it's extremely difficult to do that if you're using mega entire packages. At least with an individual package per title, you just swap out the old package for the new one and off you go. Second general recommendation, build for expected failures. And to be fair, this isn't limited to Adobe titles. Expect some of your deployments to fail and use the power in your deployment tools to detect this and try again. These failures could be anything from a device going to sleep, losing network connection, or simply a weird quirk that means you just need to rerun the installer and it will work a second time. With Monkey, you can utilize the installs array to detect if an installation worked, and if it didn't, Monkey can then try again on its next run. With Jamf, you can utilize smart groups to detect the successful installation, sort of like the same thing as Monkey, and you can build your policies to automatically retry this installation. And last general recommendation, if at all possible, have your Adobe packages installed at the login window for the most success. This is mostly down to blocking applications. So speaking of which, one challenge you might see when trying to deploy and patch Adobe titles is blocking applications. These are items that a user may be running or may be running in the background that will stop or cause failures when you try to push out an installation or an update. Some of these installs might not be obvious or easy, some of these items might not be obvious or easy for the user to close. A good example is Adobe Acrobat. This will fail if either Microsoft Outlook or Safari are open. And this is due to Acrobat trying to update some PDF-related plugins in these applications. Although Safari hasn't supported PDF plugins for years. On that note, I have been told that the Safari requirement in Adobe Acrobat packages will be being removed in the next few months. But as a result, we'd strongly recommend trying to install and patch Adobe titles when a user isn't logged in. For Monkey, simply set the Adobe packages to require logout to achieve this. Talk about Monkey. For all you Monkey admins out there, you're almost certainly going to need to use a custom installs array to make sure that Monkey can detect the Adobe installation fine. Adobe packages are actually just wrappers around their custom deployment toolsets, and so you can't rely on the usual automatic package information Monkey tries to grab out. As mentioned before, we'd strongly suggest these titles are installed at logout, and the easiest way to do this in Monkey is set the restart action key to require logout. And lastly, we had a spate of some newer Adobe packages erroring out when deployed via Monkey due to error 82. I did do some testing at the time, and what I found was essentially Monkey has some Adobe specific code that used to be required, and that would then get it's not required anymore, at least from what I've been testing. But with some packages, it was then failing with error 82. And solution was just to either remove the installer type key or set it to a blank value, because when you import this with Monkey, it would normally set this to the value of Adobe CCP installer. Now, this week I have been hearing reports that this is no longer an issue. So whatever changes Adobe made, they've either changed them again or reverted them. So this might not be a requirement anymore. For the Jamf side of things, a few recommendations. When using your smart groups to detect an installation, be aware of what titles are actually called on disk. For example, Adobe Photoshop has had the year in a name for most of its life, e.g. Adobe Photoshop 2020.app, and that can be used in a smart group as the application title you're looking for. On the other hand, Illustrator tends to be called just Adobe Illustrator.app, at least for the last few major versions. So if you need to distinguish between Illustrator 2020 versus Illustrator 2021, bit of a mouthful, you'll need to use the application title and the application version comparison in your smart groups. And again, as mentioned a couple of times already, try to run your installations when a user isn't logged in. Currently, you can do this via the logout trigger, or if you can't use that for whatever reason, you might have to look into build some sort of wrapper yourself to make sure that's the case. Lastly, with Jamf, package deployment. So Adobe packages are not flat packages, and as a result, Jamf needs them zipped prior to being uploaded for distribution. The process can sometimes not complete very well and cause failures with either the upload or your deployments. As a general good practice, I'd suggest taking the final package from Adobe, the fully downloaded and unzipped package that is, zip it up manually in Finder and then upload that. Jamf should then know what to do with that pre-zipped package during both the upload and at deployment time. It tends to give you a much higher success rate if you happen to be hitting these issues with Jamf. So I mentioned over deployment of SDLs, shared device licenses. So Adobe offers some education institutes an enterprise term license agreement, or an ETLA. Although this side of Adobe license isn't something I had to deal with, thankfully. I believe this allows you to pay Adobe based on the number of users in your institute, rather than a specific number of SDL seats you need. And as a result, you're allowed to over deploy your shared device licenses to more shared devices. If you're lucky enough to have this, like the example in the screenshot here, your SDLs will show as X out of 1, or in this case, 248 out of 1, in the product section of your portal. This means you can almost freely deploy shared device licenses to all of your shared devices and not have to worry too much about if you go over your count. If you're not privileged enough to have this sort of thing, you do need to be a bit more frugal on your deployments, but I'll discuss the ability to de-license or remove an SDL from a client device a little bit later on. And lastly, Max on Cinema 4D. So if you're deploying certain Adobe titles in the last few years, you may have noticed a copy of Cinema 4D also is installed. This will get installed as part of the After Effects package and is needed to utilize some of the plugins and options from Cinema 4D in After Effects. This is a trial or a light version, but there's also a risk of overlapping with a full installation you deploy yourself. So just something to be aware of if you deploy and manage Cinema 4D separately. Right, so you've got your users sorted, your packages created and pushed out. What next? In this section, we'll look to cover some maintenance and management tasks you may want to perform. First up, settings management. Now, this isn't covering the in-depth options inside each Adobe title, but rather the various settings for the CCDA specifically. Remember those options we picked during package creation? You can actually edit these after you deploy these packages out. The configuration file can be found at the path shown above, this serviceconfig.xml, and can be edited post-install to change things such as allowing file sync, allowing self-service app installation and updates, and to hide or show certain panels. So both Ben of MacMule and Neil, Sound Mac Guy, have great blog posts on this, which I'll share in the related post for this talk. But one thing to bear in mind, if you do edit this file, I would strongly suggest capturing it in a package and redeploying it after any Adobe updates or installs, just to ensure that the custom settings that you want to manage are what's being deployed onto devices. Late last year, Adobe released a free open source tool called the Adobe License Decoder, or ALD. The ALD can be run on devices with titles installed, on installation packages, and on recovered service config directories to decode if the item in question is using an SDL or a feature restricted license. This could be handy if you're having license oddities with your devices as part of your troubleshooting workflow. Again, I've got a blog post and a London MacAdmins talk on this. Feel free to pick those up, which I'll link in the post for this to get more information. What about installing updates for your Adobe products? First of all, to confirm, this is to do with updates to titles within the same major version. For upgrades, you'll need to have your users install from the CCDA or deploy out fresh packages to, for example, move from Photoshop 2020 to 2021. So your first option here would be to allow users to install their own updates through CCDA. This option can work well for individuals, but would be a nightmare for labs. Your second option is to use the Adobe Remote Update Manager, or RUM. RUM is a command line tool from Adobe that can be used to perform title updates. Again, it can't perform upgrades, and it can't be used for an initial installation of each title, but maybe enough to suit your needs. Again, I've got a link to a blog post that goes into more detail with that, and I'll dip into that a little bit later. The last option is to use the managed packages. This involves you as an admin creating an updated package from the admin console and redistributing this to your devices. The advantage here is that you can control the updates that go out to your devices, and you can use the same package for both an initial installation as well as an update. However, this would be at the cost of some extra time and effort from an administrator. It's also worth pointing out that you can be automatically notified of updated versions of Adobe apps that can package via email. Under your Packages tab, click Preferences on the left and click the option under the Notifications section. We at DataJar have us going into our ticketing system, which then gets picked up by one of our engineers who then goes off and does the packaging. Mentioned RUM, so let's dive a little further into the Remote Update Manager. So RUM is a command line tool that's been around for a few years to install Adobe updates on devices. There's versions of RUM for Mac and Windows, and it can work with the local Adobe update server if you fancy using one. There is, however, some limitations with RUM. It can only perform updates to titles already installed. You can't perform an upgrade from Photoshop 2020 to 2021 as an example, and it can't perform an initial installation of titles. It also can't be used to patch the gaming SDK, the Adobe Air, or the CCDA. Also, it can't patch itself, so you can't use RUM to patch RUM. Perhaps there needs to be an Adobe Remote Update Manager, Remote Update Manager. I mean, would that be a RUM, a double measure of RUM? Anyway, there's three main ways to get a copy of RUM to install onto your devices. The first way is through the admin console under the Packages, Tools, and Remote Update Manager section. And this will just download the binary file itself, so you're going to need to manually package that to deploy it to your devices. I'll suggest deploying this to USR Local Bin Remote Update Manager, since that's where Adobe Packages can also install it to. Talk about those packages. Your second option is you can include RUM automatically in any Adobe Admin Console packages you create. This is a much easier method as it's simply a tick box under the options section of the package creation wizard. This will also deploy the binary to the previously mentioned location at USR Local Bin Remote Update Manager. And this option can be found here in the packaging wizard. And lastly, there's a lovely auto package recipe from the team at Moof IT, and this will also place the tool into the same location. Check out their auto package recipe if that's of interest. So how do you use RUM? As mentioned, this is a command line tool, so no GUI. Unlike the licensing toolkit, it will require admin rights, so any scripts you run using it will need to take that into consideration. Let's take a look at an example command. The first line is a typical path to the binary, although this can vary depending on where you're deploying RUM on your devices. Next up is channel ID or IDs of the titles you wish to work on. Channel IDs are the values used to denote the specific Adobe title and version. You can specify multiple channel IDs separated by a comma but no space to be able to work on multiple applications on the same command. You can also completely omit the channel ID option to have RUM work on all installed applications. The URL above has a link of all the valid channel IDs. One thing I should point out, probably should have led with this, channel IDs is only valid for Adobe titles up to CC 2015. So you're probably not going to use this much. For those newer titles, you need to be using the product versions command. So these are the same as channel IDs, but just for newer titles. And instead of using a list of IDs, you instead use a list of SAP codes for that title. Again, you can specify multiple SAP codes separated by a comma. And again, if you omit both, it will work on all locally installed applications. And again, there's a URL shown here, which will give you a link to those SAP codes. And lastly, we have the action commands. If no action is provided, the tool will go off and install any available updates it can find. Other than that, there are three valid options for the action command. list, download, and install. List will check and display a list of available updates for the device. The output of this can be a little bit tricky, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone couldn't turn that into something like an XAMPP extension attribute or a monkey report value. Download will check and download the specified updates that are available, but it will not carry out any installations. And lastly, install will check, download, and install the specified updates that are available. If an update has already been downloaded, Run will use that local copy. One helpful thing to note is that install command will also install any updated supported items, such as a camera raw update, if that's also needed. So about some examples. So for this, I built it out of VM and I had the latest version of Adobe Photoshop 2021 at the time. I had an older version of Photoshop 2020 and an older version of Premiere Pro 2020. For our first example, I'm just going to run the run command with no additional options or actions. You can see here that run has picked up the need to update Photoshop and Premiere Pro and has started the downloads of these titles. If we move further down, you can see the updates being installed and run exiting with a return code of 0. Job done. This time, I'm going to use the exact same command as before. However, I'm going to have Photoshop 2020 open and running at the same time. Again, you can see the expected checking and downloading of the titles. However, as we move further down, you can see run failed to install Photoshop 2020 as the app was running. Note that log output and that return code of 2. Now, Adobe do warn against using run to update an application that's open, but they don't go into any further details on what could happen. In my very, very basic testing, I haven't seen any issues with this, but it would still be worth avoiding doing stuff the vendor doesn't recommend. Last example I'll use here is the list action on run, but running it from a XAMPP policy. Although probably not that usable here, it's still pretty cool. You can see quite nicely formatted output in those policy logs. Something that's quite helpful if you're maybe going to run Remote Update Manager from a XAMPP policy. Last two sections on run, troubleshooting. So we've seen a few examples of the return codes that run provides, and these boil down to 3 options. A return code of 0, that means run ran and was happy with any task it was given as part of that run. It could be that all the updates were installed and downloaded, or that there just wasn't any updates that were needed. A return code of 1, this means that run had an issue and couldn't complete the task. It could be that there wasn't a network connection, the application was open, or some sort of other miscellaneous error. And a return code of 2. So this means that run was given a number of tasks. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. So typically this would be if you need to install multiple updates. And again, some worked, some didn't. Run kind of was half successful, half not. Last slide on run. Forget to say goodbye to Johnny Depp. Run will output information on its tasks to a log file. Now, the strange thing is this log file location changes depending on who's logged into the device. And it doesn't matter if a user ran run using sudo, a launch agent triggered it, or a management system. If someone was logged in, the logs go into library logs remote update manager.log inside that logged in user's library folder. If no one is logged in, this instead goes to the same location but in root's library folder. Strange indeed. We'll cover a bit more about collecting Adobe logs later on. So I mentioned we'd talk about this, so we shall. Although not officially supported outside of wiping a device, it is possible to remove an SDL from a deployed device, converting that Adobe installation back to a named user license. I'm afraid it isn't as simple as clicking that old deactivate button you see in the portal, as the device will automatically reactivate with that SDL the next time any Adobe ID logs in. Instead, what you must, okay, step 1, you do have to click that button in the portal, the deactivate button, or you can deactivate the license locally using the Adobe licensing toolkit. You can find that in your admin console under tools. The second step you need to do after that is to remove the operating configs directory found at Library, Application Support, Adobe Operating Configs. Once you've done both those steps, give that Mac a restart, and the next time you launch an Adobe title, the SDL will be removed and the device will need an Adobe ID with some sort of named user license attached in order to use the apps. Talk about removing things. How about removing titles? Well, we've got a few options here. First of all, the most straightforward option, nuke and pave. Just wipe that device, reinstall macOS. There you go, Adobe removed. The second option, which has become a lot more difficult, is creating a uninstall all the things package. Thirdly, we each have we can use each managed package's own uninstaller package. And lastly, the command line. Let's get stuck in. So I'm going to skip the nuke and pave option because that's kind of mostly understood. Full erase, reinstall macOS, new out of box kind of thing. For the uninstall all the things package, this is something I covered back in my 2019 talk. It requires you to have an active copy of CCP that you can actually run. And the issue here is that CCP has a number of 32-bit components. So straight away, you're going to need a Mac that's on 1014 or older to even be able to launch the tool. The outputted removal package is almost certainly also going to contain some 32-bit components, which again means you're only going to be able to use this on macOS 1014 or older. The last key limitation here is that it only goes up to the CC 2019 titles for removal, and due to that move to the admin console, this is probably not going to change anytime soon. But the real usability of this method comes in your options. So this CCP will give you the chance to remove a specific major version of a title, remove all major versions of a title, and or apply that same thing to multiple titles, all within a same package. So quite powerful, but unfortunately, almost entirely out of use nowadays. For uninstaller packages, you will find these included with every managed package you produce from the admin console. It has to be a managed package. Self-service package, you won't get this. These will be inside the same zip bundle you download that contains your installer package. And you would load these into your management system of choice and run them just as a normal installation package. And instead of installing software, it would remove that specific Adobe title. For Monkey users, you can import the uninstaller package alongside your install packages, and you can link the two using that uninstall PKG option that I've got shown above. This means that when you move the respective Adobe title from a managed install to a managed uninstall, Monkey will use the uninstaller package to perform that uninstall. And lastly, uninstall from the command line. So this will work for any titles that have a hyperdrive type installer. This was a newer installer technology that Adobe developed maybe about 5 or 6 years ago now, and almost all, if not all, Adobe titles should be using this. To use this command, you're going to need to know both the SAP code and base version of the item or items you wish to remove. And I have example command shown above, but let's break that down a bit. First line, pretty straightforward. It's the path to the tool where it's installed when you deployed your Adobe title automatically. Note the spaces. Make sure you quote or escape these as needed. First option provided to the package is the uninstall flag to, well, you guessed it, to let the tool know we want to perform an uninstall. The next option is the SAP code of the title we wish to uninstall. These aren't always obvious, but Adobe has a reference table available at this URL. Next up is the base version or major version of the title we wish to uninstall. These will rarely, if ever, match the PR versions. For example, Photoshop 2020 will not have a base version of 20.0. But again, Adobe has a reference table at this same URL for these. And again, if you can't see the version you need to remove on that list, there's a previous version section right at the bottom that you need to expand and you can browse through. Next up is the platform. For macOS devices, this would normally be as above, but I've not had a chance to try this on Apple Silicon devices, but I guess this will have to change. Currently, this key isn't detailed any further in the Adobe's documentation, so if anyone happens to experiment with this, let the group know how it goes. The last option shown here is the delete user preferences option. With this set to true, the tool will also try to remove any related preferences in user areas. Personally, I'll suggest setting this to false unless you have a very specific need to remove these items. Two additional options I didn't show in my example. The removal flag will try to remove all Adobe titles. If you use this, you can omit the SAP code and base version options. And the very last option here is the EULA accepted one. This is an undocumented flag to automatically accept the EULA when removing all installed titles. Thanks to Foigus and Slack for sharing that discovery and a few others throughout this talk. With uninstallations, there's one additional gotcha to be aware of. The CCDA cannot be removed if there's at least one Adobe title still present on the device. The CCDA is used for both licensing of local installations as well as user interactions such as Adobe Id logins and prompts. So it kind of makes sense for that one. So whatever workflows you use to remove your Adobe titles, bear that in mind and build around it. Don't expect to be able to leave Adobe titles in place and then try and uninstall the CCDA. Right, so you've got everything set up and running, but what if you have an issue? What if you hit some sort of unexpected behavior? What can you do? So first of all, you're paying Adobe's licensing, so it stands to reason you probably should use some of that paid for licensing for support. Adobe has a list of all of their international numbers at the above link, including multilingual support lines. Another way to log a support ticket is via your admin console. This can be found at Admin Console, Support tab, and in either Start Chat or Request an Expert Session. The Request an Expert Session is a really great option if you're having difficulty, especially with setting up and using more intricate parts of SDL, as you will normally get put through to the exact right representative who can help you out. And lastly, there's the User Voice Forum. For Jamf customers, this is basically like the feature request section of Jamf Nation, but for Adobe. It's worth taking a look through here and upvoting or commenting on any that would make any sense to you or be helpful. It also can be used to report bugs. Now, a few support-related changes. So back in December 2020, Adobe announced their long-term support or LTS guidelines, and they also use this to clarify their support for their products. LTS is automatically available to all Teams and enterprise customers, including education. They'll provide full support for all current latest products. This means security and feature patches for all 2021 titles currently. For the next oldest set of products, currently 2020 suite, these will only get security patches for customers with LTS support. Anything older than that will have minimal support and no further patches, including no security patches. And any title more than 3 versions behind are not supported and not available for download. Let me just go through that again. Any titles more than 3 versions behind current are not supported by Adobe. Additionally, you will not be able to download these installers through the admin console. Now, this follows the same sort of line as Apple and a bunch of other Apple software developers, so it shouldn't be a huge problem. However, if you do have a genuine need to run these older Adobe titles, the recommendation is to keep all of your installers you currently have somewhere safe and backed up. Next up, Adobe Flash Player. It's dead. It's finally dead. It's finally gone the way of the dodo. Middle of January 2021, Adobe activated a kill switch to stop Flash content from running. They also reiterated that any Flash Player installs should be removed immediately and no support or patches will be provided. I know it's possible to mess around with the date and time on devices to get Flash running again, but please don't do this. It's a huge risk and it's a very bad idea. One last bit to note on Flash Player, there is indeed a Flash Player framework within the Animate application. This is still supported and patched by Adobe for certain use cases and is unrelated to usage in a browser on the device. Please don't try to manually remove that, as you will probably break Animate. This is a strange one. Back in March this year, Adobe users reported a random library directory appearing in a documents folder, which they did not have permission to access. And this is a bug introduced by a CCDA update. This shouldn't be reoccurring, and a recent updates to CCDA should be fixing this. But if you still see this on some devices, it should be safe to just remove, but you'll need admin rights. So I tried to cover as much relevant information as possible in this talk, as well as my previous 3 talks. However, there's always some areas I've had to gloss over or stick to a high-level description of. Also, and this is true of myself, sometimes I like to see a few different ways of covering the same material to ensure I fully understand it. So I would strongly recommend you take some time to read over the Adobe deployment documentation to ensure you can take advantage of every part of the SDL system that you can. To help, Adobe have a great deployment guide that I can't recommend enough, which you'll find at this link. Although it's not been updated in over a year, annoyingly, There's a nice SDL What's New KB that was being updated with all the changes and new features of the SDL product. It's certainly made writing these blogs a lot easier in these talks. Also, there's an Adobe SDL Known Issues KB that's worth consulting if you're hitting any unexpected issues. A little bit on logs. Adobe products and installers will put log and config files into various places on a device, which can make troubleshooting issues much harder. To help with this, they have a free tool called the Adobe Log Collector tool. You can download this from that link shown above. When you have reproduced whatever issue you're having, run this tool to collect all the login information and copy it to a central location. The tool will need you to authenticate as a local admin user and will talk you through the process. The outputted file is a compressed file in the ZXP format. Simply rename this to be .zip, decompress, and you can browse through the logs at your leisure. This is really good for troubleshooting deployment issues and installation issues. A recent addition to the admin console is the Audit Logs, accessible admin console insight logs audit log. These logs can be helpful for troubleshooting things like users being added or removed, changes of group membership, as well as why a user may have lost or added a license unintended. Those are kept for 90 days and you can view them both in the console and export as a CSV. And of all this stuff, Adobe have a great KB on the subject. I realize I'm running slightly long. I'm trying to get through the last few slides. So we covered a lot of Adobe support materials, but there's other resources you could use. First of all is the MacAdmins Slack and specifically the Adobe channel. Myself and a lot of other Adobe admins will hang out there, happy to help out wherever we can. Next up, yes, it's a plug. There's other talks, including my previous two for Penn State. And lastly, blogs. We have MacMule, Sound Mac Guy, Mac OS X Bytes blogs, as well as my own that have been mentioned throughout this talk. All of these will also be available in the blog feed channel of MacAdmins Slack. So feel free to join that channel and spot any new posts as they are released. That's the bulk of the talk covered, but one more thing. I did promise to share if you could actually deploy CS6 fireworks to Big Sur. And the answer is no, at least I couldn't. So in order to produce an installer package for fireworks, I needed the old Creative Cloud packager, and it's a 32-bit app that needs to be on a 1014 VM. And in theory, that would mean at least some of that package would be 32-bit, which means it's just not going to run on Big Sur. However, before I even got to the point of being able to create that package, I got repeated failures in downloading the Adobe Fireworks components within CCP before I could even produce the package. So it looks like I'm afraid Fireworks may have finally died off. Thanks again to listening to me ramble on, and I hope you got some benefit out of things I've covered today, and apologies for running slightly long. All the links and a copy of the slides should be available at the above link. Thank you.
All right, well, let's jump into some Q&A. Thank you, Darren, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to go ahead with the first question, which is, how can shared device licensing allow computers to get updates to be installed automatically instead of pushing updates by IT people?
So shared device licensing is purely around licensing. It has nothing to do with deployment, nothing to do with updating or installations. For that, you're going to need to either generate your packages, push out the CCDA, maybe look at RUM, all those other options. Unfortunately, it's purely about licensing. Similar to Microsoft's volume licensing, is nothing to do with installation of the products.
Okay. The second question we have is a bit of a scenario. So Adobe Creative Cloud apps and Adobe Creative Cloud desktop application have been installed on computers, but the Adobe Creative Cloud desktop needs to be repaired because something was corrupted. But the Adobe Creative Cloud desktop application cannot be repaired or reinstalled unless all Adobe Creative Cloud apps are uninstalled. How can Adobe Creative Cloud desktop application be fixed itself without existing Adobe CC apps being uninstalled? I think is the thrust of that question.
Totally. So you can go down the route of uninstalling it, which there is a necessity to then remove all the other Adobe apps, which, as you mentioned, is not a small task. My recommendation, worth a shot at least, is to go to your Creative Cloud. Go to your Adobe admin console, generate a new package with no other apps added. So you've just got your CCDA, and just try and install it over the top and see if that's enough to repair it. If it isn't, have a look at the Adobe Log Collector tool to see if there are any logs that come out of there are helpful. But I'd also strongly suggest reaching out to Adobe. Any day you're paying for the support, might as well get some use out of it.
Okay. Does RUM now work on M1 hardware? It was not detecting available updates the last time I tried, and this user indicates about a month ago they tried.
It may have been the same user. I did see someone mention this in the Adobe channel, and I'm afraid personally I didn't get a chance to test that before the presentation, partially because you can't VM M1 devices yet, or M1 OS, I guess. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. I don't think there's any documentation about RUM support levels. There's some for some of the Adobe apps themselves, but not RUM's more of an admin feature. Again, definitely reach out to your reps and share the knowledge if you don't mind.
Yes. Did anyone else go out and create an Apple Silicon package or the Creative Cloud suite during your talk? I found that very informative. Thorough. Thank you, Darren, for that. Let's see. We had somebody ask if they could put the RQ back up again.
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you what, if they don't mind jumping into the MacAdmins Slack channel after this, I'll just paste a link in.
Let's do that there. I'll just move on to the next question there, and check the Slack channel for the RQ there. Okay. Are you familiar with the Adobe PDF plugin that gets installed for Office apps? Link creation.m for Word, save as Adobe PDF, .ppam for PowerPoint, etc. And how they are causing Word and PowerPoint to crash.
So
there's
I'm
more
very
detail there, but no, go ahead.
I'm very lucky that I deploy software. I can launch Photoshop, I can click a couple of buttons and go, yeah, it hasn't crashed. So as far as that kind of stuff goes, I'm not a favor of the usability. I do understand that Acrobat does try put a plugin into Outlook. I'm not aware of any issues specifically. It might be I'm very lucky and I've not had a chance to hit them yet. I mean, it'd be the usual things. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Darren.
I would say the usual things of, try removing it, try updating all the bits and pieces, maybe reach out to the folks in the Microsoft Office channel as well to see if anyone else has hit that issue. I know they did play around with removing plugins and then didn't remove plugin support and then put it back in or something with Office recently.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Maybe someone else in Slack, because it could be an Office issue. It seems like they're saying that it just disappeared. Never mind. Okay, that was the last Q&A question we have. I think we'll wait maybe another minute just to see if there's any last ones, and then I'll have Josh take it away from here.
No problem. I mean, I'll be in the Slack channel for a little bit longer tonight. Anyway, it might be best getting questions in earlier than later because I might crack a beer or two. So, just saying.
Okay, Josh, do you want to take the last question and then close it out?
Absolutely. So we just got this last question. It says, I was told that Adobe will be releasing an option for education that will allow device licensing. Have you heard anything about it?
All I'm aware of is they did that. They took it away and replaced it with shared device licensing. And that is, as far as they're concerned, as far as I'm aware, again, I don't have much insider information at all, but that is their offering for shared devices, is the shared device licensing for that.
Great. And just a final follow-up to your the previous question, someone did post that the Acrobat plugin is a persistent issue across versions.
Yay.
So with that, I'd like to thank Darren for taking the time to deliver us today's second session.